April 14, 1945, 1847 hours, Stendal, Germany. A lone TA-152 sliced through the fading light at 469 miles per hour, higher and faster than anything the Allies could reach. Oberfeldwebel Willy Reschke tightened his gloved hand around the throttle as 4 P-51 Mustangs appeared below him, silver crosses drifting over a battlefield smeared with smoke. At 40,000 feet, the TA-152's Jumo 213E engine, its two-stage supercharger screaming in the thin air, kept pulling. The American Merlins beneath him were already starving for oxygen, but Reschke wasn't chasing easy kills. He was about to prove something the world would never fully see, that Germany had built a piston fighter faster, deadlier, and more advanced than anything flying in 1945, a machine that arrived 6 months too late to matter. What happened over the next 90 seconds stunned Allied intelligence. 2 Mustangs fell. A third limped home with its fuselage ripped open. The 4th pilot filed a report so alarming it stayed classified for decades. But that brief, savage fight was only a sliver of a bigger story. A story written in blood, mathematics, and desperation across 5 years of total war. A story about 8 piston fighters that pushed technology beyond the limits of propellers, engines, and even human endurance. For 80 years, the argument has echoed through hangars, air shows, and engineering symposiums. Which propeller fighter was truly the fastest? Not the prettiest, not the most famous, the fastest. The answer isn't found in propaganda posters or pilot bragging. It's buried in official test data, wartime performance trials, and documents stamped secret that wouldn't surface for half a century. Every aircraft we're about to examine actually flew, actually fought, actually bled. These weren't paper dreams or hangar queens. They were instruments of survival built by nations facing annihilation. Nations that poured bottomless resources into gaining even 1 more mile per hour, because that single mile could mean the difference between a pilot returning home or becoming another name carved in stone. Let's count them down, 8 to 1, slowest to fastest. But understand this, we're not ranking machines, we're ranking desperation. Focke-Wulf FW-190D9, maximum speed, 426 miles per hour. August 1944, Jagdgeschwader 54 received the first production FW-190D9s, the Dora, just as the Western Allies smashed through France and the Eastern Front collapsed into apocalyptic retreat. The radial-engined FW-190A had terrorized Allied pilots since 1941, a brutal low-altitude brawler with a roll rate that could reverse a dive and put guns on target before Spitfire pilots could blink. But by late 1944, altitude had become the new battlefield. American B-17s cruised 25,000 feet. The FW-190A gasped and wheezed up there, its BMW radial choking on thin air. So Focke-Wulf's engineers did something radical. They ripped out the radial and installed an inline Junkos 213A, stretching the nose into a predatory snout that gave the D9 its nickname, Longnase, the long nose. The transformation was immediate and violent. Lieutenant Oscar Rahm, a veteran with dozens of kills, climbed into a Dora for the first time in September 1944. He wrote, "The Dora handled better than the FW-190A, faster, superior rate of climb. During dogfights between 10,000 and 24,000 feet, I could pull the FW-190D into a tight turn and still retain my speed advantage. In the A-type, I'd have to reduce to minimum flying speed in the turn. In a dive, the Dora could leave Russian Yak 3s and Yak 9s standing." But not everyone agreed. Oberlieutenant Hans Hartigs hated it. He said flatly, "The FW-190D9 I did not enjoy flying. I found earlier types much better in dogfights. The engine ran more roughly, and it was very insensitive when shooting." The debate was settled in blood. Over the winter 1944-45, Dora pilots flew top cover for Me-262 jets during their most vulnerable moments, takeoff and landing, when the revolutionary turbines were sitting ducks. The D9s clawed for altitude, rolled into diving attacks, and met Mustangs and Tempests in turning fights that left condensation trails spiraling through freezing air. More than 700 Doras were built before Germany collapsed. Most were destroyed on the ground by fuel shortages or Allied bombing. The pilots who flew them, the survivors, never forgot. The contradiction, a magnificent fighter born into a lost war. One American test pilot who flew a captured Dora after VE Day called it a splendid machine. But splendid wasn't enough. Hawker Tempest Mark V, maximum speed 435 miles per hour. June 13, 1944, 0418 hours. A low buzzing sound, like a motorcycle engine crossed with a chainsaw, rattled windows across southern England. Germany's Vergeltungswaffe V1, the flying bomb, had arrived. Hitler's vengeance weapon was crude. A pulse jet engine strapped to a one-ton warhead with stubby wings and a gyroscopic guidance system. It flew at 400 miles per hour and 3,000 feet, straight and dumb as a bullet, aimed at London. When the fuel ran out, the engine cut, the V1 nosed over, and everything below ceased to exist. The RAF threw everything at them: Spitfires, Typhoons, even early Gloucester Meteors. But only one fighter consistently caught the V1s in level flight: the Hawker Tempest. Developed from the troubled Typhoon, the Tempest featured a thinner wing profile and the monstrous Napier Sabre engine, 24 cylinders arranged in an H pattern, generating 2,400 horsepower and a sound like tearing metal. At low altitude, where the V1s droned toward London, the Tempest was the fastest thing Britain had. Flying Officer James McCaw of No. 486 Squadron became a specialist. On one mission in July 1944, he shot down 4 V1s in 2 hours, each one requiring a screaming dive to overtake the bomb, a precise burst of 20mm cannon fire, and then a violent brake to avoid the explosion. McCaw's gun camera footage shows the V1 disintegrating mid-air, its warhead detonating in an orange fireball that filled the frame. But shooting them was dangerous. Some pilots developed a different technique. They flew alongside the V1 at 400+ miles per hour, carefully positioned their wingtip under the bomb's stubby wing, and tipped it, using aerodynamic force to flip the V1's gyroscope and send it tumbling into the channel or open countryside. Squadron leader Joseph Barry of No. 501 Squadron destroyed 59 V1s. Squadron leader Remy van Lierde, a Belgian ace, claimed 44. The Tempest squadrons of 150 wing accounted for 638 flying bombs between June and September 1944. No. 3 Squadron alone claimed 305. But the Tempest wasn't just a bomb chaser. In air-to-air combat against FW-190s and BF-109s, it proved lethal. Fast, heavily armed, and viciously maneuverable at low altitude. In the final year of the war, Tempest squadrons racked up kill ratios that shocked even veteran Spitfire units. Many British pilots considered it the finest piston fighter Britain ever produced. Then everything changed. Supermarine Spitfire Mark 14. Maximum speed 446 miles per hour. January 1943. Rolls-Royce test pilot Don Healy strapped into the prototype and fired up the engine. The sound was wrong. Every Spitfire since 1936 had sung with the Merlin V-12's distinctive howl, 1,000 to 1,500 horsepower of liquid-cooled precision. But the Mark 14 carried a Griffin 65, a 2-stage supercharged monster generating over 2,000 horsepower. The entire airframe had been strengthened, the tail enlarged, the propeller blades broadened to absorb the savage torque. This wasn't an evolution of the Spitfire, it was a transformation. Healy advanced the throttle. The Mark 14 leaped forward like it had been kicked. In 5 minutes, it reached 20,000 feet, an altitude that took earlier Spitfires twice as long. At 25,400 feet, it touched 446 miles per hour. With 150-octane fuel introduced in mid-1944, the boost pressure increased to plus 25 pounds, adding another 30 miles per hour at low altitude, 400 miles per hour at 2,000 feet. The acceleration shocked German pilots accustomed to outrunning earlier Spitfire marks. But the Mark 14 was difficult. Pilots transitioning from Mark 9s found it temperamental, tail-heavy, and brutal in its power delivery. The Griffin consumed fuel at a voracious rate, cutting range to barely 460 miles on internal tanks. Later variants added a 33-gallon fuselage tank, extending range to 850 miles with a drop tank. By December 1944, 6 squadrons of Mark 14s operated over northern Europe as the 2nd Tactical Air Force's primary high-altitude interceptors. They hunted FW-190s D-9s and Med-262 jets. They escorted bombers deep into Germany. They dove on reconnaissance Bf-109s at 35,000 feet and caught them. The Mark 14 proved most successful intercepting V-1 flying bombs. It was the highest-scoring Spitfire variant against Hitler's Vengeance weapons. Over 900 were built. They served until war's end, flown by pilots who described it as splendid and potent, and occasionally a handful. But even the Mark 14 was about to be outclassed. Grumman F-8F Bearcat, maximum speed, 455 miles per hour. Grumman's engineers started with a question: what if we built the smallest, lightest airframe that could handle the most powerful engine available? The answer was the F-8F Bearcat. They took the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 2,100 horsepower of 18-cylinder radial fury, and wrapped it in the tightest possible package. The result was a carrier fighter that could climb to 10,000 feet in 97 seconds, faster than any American fighter of the era. Its roll rate was phenomenal. Despite its compact size, it packed 4 20mm cannons or 6.50 caliber machine guns. Test pilots called it the finest handling fighter of the propeller era. But timing is everything in war. The Bearcat entered service on May 21, 1945, when U.S. Navy Squadron VF-19 took delivery of the first production aircraft. By August, when Japan surrendered, only 24 F-8Fs had reached operational squadrons. Not one fired its guns in anger during World War II. The Navy had ordered over 2,000 Bearcats in February 1945, anticipating the bloody invasion of Japan. When the atomic bombs fell and Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over Japanese radio announcing surrender, 1,258 of those orders were canceled. The Bearcat would go on to serve through the 1950s, become the mount of the Blue Angels, and set multiple time-to-climb records that stood for decades. But it would always carry the label, the ultimate carrier fighter that arrived 6 months too late to prove itself. History is written by those who arrive on time. Focke-Wulf Ta-152H, maximum speed, 469 miles per hour. November 1944. Germany was dying. The Luftwaffe, once masters of European skies, was reduced to scattered Jagdgeschwader flying from cratered airfields, burning synthetic fuel so poor it destroyed engines after 30 hours. American and British bombers operated with near impunity above 30,000 feet, where most German fighters struggled to even reach combat altitude. Focke-Wulf's answer was the Ta-152H, a high-altitude interceptor with extended wings spanning nearly 48 feet, a pressurized cockpit, and that same Junkers J213E with a 2-stage supercharger. Above 40,000 feet, where Allied fighters gasped for air, the Ta-152H was dominant. It could outclimb, outrun, and outmaneuver virtually any opponent at that altitude. But perhaps 150 were built before the war ended. Few reached operational units. Fewer still saw combat. April 14, 1945. Oberfeldwebel Willy Reschke, flying Ta-152H Green 9, engaged 4 P-51D Mustangs at high altitude near Stendal. What happened next became legend. Reschke dove from above, a standard bounce, but his speed advantage at altitude was devastating. The Mustangs broke formation. Reschke's cannons hammered one P-51, which nosed over trailing smoke. He reversed hard, energy retention at that altitude, giving him a turning advantage the Mustang pilots couldn't match. A second Mustang fell. A third took hits that shredded its fuselage, but managed to disengage. The fourth pilot broke for cloud cover and dove for the deck, where his Merlin engine had the advantage. Reschke climbed back to altitude and headed home. The American pilots filed reports describing unknown German aircraft with exceptional high-altitude performance. Intelligence officers marked the encounter as extraordinary. But Reschke's victory was meaningless. 10 days later, he would claim 2 Soviet Yak-9s near Berlin, his last kills of the war. On May 8, 1945, he landed his Ta-152H at Lech Airfield in northern Germany and handed it over to British forces. Test pilot Eric Brown flew Green 9 and called it remarkable. Then it was scrapped. The Ta-152H symbolized Germany's technological desperation, an outstanding design that arrived when Germany lacked the fuel, pilots, and infrastructure to employ it effectively. What might have been a game-changer in 1943 became a footnote in 1945. But the Allies had their own monsters. Republic P-47M Thunderbolt, maximum speed 472 miles per hour. The P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately called the Jug, was never subtle. 8.50 caliber machine guns, 2,000 horsepower, a fuselage so robust it could absorb 20mm cannon fire and still bring its pilot home. But by late 1944, the Jug had a problem: German jets. The Me-262 could hit 540 miles per hour. Standard P-47Ds, maxing out around 433 miles per hour, couldn't catch them. So Republic Aircraft Corporation built the P-47M, a Thunderbolt on steroids. They installed a specially modified Pratt & Whitney R2857 engine with an improved turbocharger system, water injection for emergency power, and aggressive weight-saving modifications. The result: 472 miles per hour at altitude, enough to engage jets and exceed virtually any German piston fighter. Only 130 P-47Ms were built. All went to the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, the only unit to operate the type. The 56th had specifically requested a faster Thunderbolt to counter the increasing jet threat. But the P-47M was temperamental. The high-performance engine required meticulous maintenance. Early models suffered catastrophic engine failures that grounded the entire fleet for weeks, while engineers traced the problem to faulty connecting rods and improper maintenance procedures. Mechanics discovered that the R2857's 18 cylinders, each with its own pressure carburetor and 2 spark plugs, demanded precise tuning. Screw up the fuel mixture and you'd foul all 36 spark plugs. Once these issues were resolved in March 1945, the P-47M became lethal. It combined the Thunderbolt's legendary toughness and devastating firepower with speed that could match or exceed any German fighter. The 56th Fighter Group flew P-47Ms until war's end, racking up kills against both conventional fighters and early jets. The 56th Fighter Group would finish the war credited with 665.5 air-to-air kills, more than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force. But the P-47M represented the absolute limit of what could be achieved with the basic Thunderbolt design. You couldn't make it any faster without fundamentally rethinking the entire concept. Someone else already had. Dornier D-335 File. Maximum speed, 474 miles per hour. It looked like something from a science fiction pulp magazine. 2 engines, 2 propellers, one at the nose, one at the tail. A push-pull configuration unlike anything else that flew during World War II. The concept was brilliant. Mounting one Daimler-Benz DB603 engine conventionally in the nose and another behind the cockpit driving a pusher propeller at the tail eliminated the drag of wing-mounted engines while doubling available power. The result was a fighter with straight-line speed that exceeded almost everything in the sky. 474 miles per hour in level flight, combined with heavy armament and armor that would have made it formidable in combat. But like the Ta-152, the Do-335 arrived too late. Development delays meant the first prototype didn't fly until October 1943. Production aircraft began reaching test units in early 1945, but perhaps only 37 were completed before Germany collapsed. None saw genuine combat. April 1945, French ace Pierre Clostermann, leading a flight of 4 Hawker Tempests from No. 3 Squadron RAF over northern Germany, spotted an unknown aircraft at treetop level. The description matched the Do-335. Detecting the British fighters, the German pilot reversed course to evade. 2 Tempest pilots opened fire. Clostermann, despite the Tempest's considerable low-altitude speed, decided not to chase it. It was obviously much faster, he later wrote. The Do-335 disappeared into the haze. All Allied test pilots who flew captured examples after the war universally praised its speed and handling, calling it one of the finest piston-engine fighters ever built, had it arrived 2 years earlier. But it didn't. The DO 335 represented German engineering at its most innovative and most desperate. Fast, heavily armed, unlike anything else flying. But its complexity, late arrival, and Germany's collapsing industrial base meant it never had a chance to prove itself in battle. Which brings us to number 1. North American P-51H Mustang. Maximum speed, 487 miles per hour. This is what victory looked like when victory could afford perfection. The P-51 Mustang was already legendary by 1945, the long-range escort fighter that made deep penetration bomber raids possible, the sleek silver killer that cleared German skies. But North American aviation wasn't satisfied. The P-51H was a comprehensive redesign. Engineers stripped nearly 1,500 pounds from the airframe through lighter construction techniques, a redesigned fuselage, and removal of unnecessary equipment. They installed the powerful Packard 1659 engine with water injection for emergency power. The result was 487 miles per hour in level flight, nearly 500 miles per hour with a propeller. But speed wasn't everything. The weight reduction transformed the Mustang's handling characteristics. The P-51H rolled faster, climbed quicker, and maneuvered more nimbly than any previous variant. Test pilots called it the finest handling Mustang ever built. It retained the P-51's famous range, over 850 miles on internal fuel, meaning it could escort bombers deep into Japan while outrunning virtually any defender. Production began in February 1945. By August, when atomic bombs ended the war, 555 had been delivered. They arrived too late for combat in Europe. Some reached the Pacific, but none engaged in air combat before Japan surrendered. But the P-51H represented what was possible at the absolute edge of propeller fighter design. It was faster, lighter, and more capable than anything else with a piston. In a war that drove aviation technology to unprecedented heights, the P-51H stood at the summit. Look at that list again. Just 61 miles per hour separates the FW-90D9 at number 8 from the P-51H at number 1. 61 miles per hour across 5 years of total war. Every single mile per hour came from countless hours of testing, incremental improvements, and desperate innovation under wartime pressure. Each aircraft on this list was a masterpiece of engineering that could mean the difference between life and death for the men who flew them. A P-51 pilot who flew 70 combat missions, 300 combat hours, described the speed. We're going 400, 450, 500 miles an hour, and so are the German fighters. You start diving, you're getting up to 550, 600 miles an hour sometimes. Fights don't last 15, 20, 30 minutes. 5 minutes is pretty long. At the speeds you're going, they don't last very long. 5 minutes to live or die. That's what these speeds meant. A lot of times if you hit them real hard, they just jerk and snap and roll, the pilot continued. You know you've hit them bad, they go completely out of control. One time I was in a real tight turn and I hit a guy on the wing and I cut his wing off. My camera film shows the wing just disintegrating, and of course then he went out of control completely. He was at a real high speed with one wing, and he's done. Speed, of course, wasn't everything in aerial combat. Maneuverability, firepower, range, reliability, pilot skill, all mattered enormously. But in a war where seconds determined survival, where catching an enemy bomber before it reached its target could save thousands of lives, and where escaping superior numbers meant living to fight another day, speed was the ultimate advantage. These 8 fighters, German, British, American, represented the pinnacle of propeller-driven aviation. They were designed during humanity's most desperate conflict, when nations poured unlimited resources into gaining even the slightest edge in the sky. The engineers who designed them and the pilots who flew them pushed the boundaries of what was possible with piston engines and propellers. And then, suddenly, it was over. Jets arrived, propellers became obsolete. The fastest piston fighter ever built, the P-51H, never fired its guns in anger. But for 5 years, from 1940 to 1945, these machines represented the cutting edge of human capability. They were flown by teenagers and veterans, farm boys and factory workers, men who climbed into cockpits at 30,000 feet where temperatures dropped to 60 below zero and stayed there for 6 hours at a time. "That's a long time in a cockpit all by yourself," one P-51 pilot said. "Long enough to think about speed, about home, about whether you'd see either again." These 8 fighters, these 426 to 487 miles per hour, represent more than engineering triumphs. They represent the measure of how desperately humanity wanted to survive, and how fast we were willing to fly to do it. Now you know, the 8 fastest propeller fighters of World War II, ranked by documented performance data. Disagree? Think another aircraft deserves to be here? Drop a comment below and tell me which fighter you believe was truly the fastest, and why. Let's keep this conversation alive, because forgetting these machines means forgetting the men who flew them, and that's something we can never afford to do. If you disagree with this ranking, tell me. I want to hear your version and your reasoning.